Yuma, and welcome to the ANU Archives 2022 lecture. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands we meet today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the custody and care of culture by First Nations peoples of this country for generations. My name is Catherine Dan, University Archivist at the ANU, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Archives and the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives Centre. The lecture is organised annually in conjunction with the Friends, and they support the Archives work, particularly through fundraising for conservation work on fragile and significant items. You can find information about joining the Friends and staying in touch via the Archives website. This year we're delighted to welcome Professor Emerita Marian Quartly as this year's lecturer. A distinguished historian with considered views about archives. As long ago as 1991, and I'm not sure if she remembers, Professor Quartly spoke at the Australian Archivists Professional Conference on the relative roles of the professions of historian and archivist. So she has thought about these sorts of issues. And it's 20 years since our first ANU Archives annual lecture, a great cause for celebration, and I'm really delighted that we're joined by our inaugural speaker from 2002, Professor Ray Francis, Distinguished Scholar and retiring Dean of the College of Arts and Social Sciences. At that time, Professor Francis spoke of her own relationship with archives in her lecture, beautiful title, Confessions of a Promiscuous Researcher. And I hope that the future will provide a lot of time for research in the archives. This year, the lecture focuses on the Australian Natives Association, a friendly society, one of those organisations that provided mutual assistance, social connection, and financial benefit to many people in a time before broad government social security schemes. The Noel Butlin Archives Centre holds the records of many friendly societies, including the gloriously named Ancient Order of Foresters, the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, Manchester Unity and others. It's a privilege to have Professor Quartly with us to speak about the role of that one friendly society, the Australian Natives Association, and the role it played and the way that it had a role in politics and social movements. Yes, so I think it will be very interesting. From the Monash School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies, Professor Quartly's most cited works are Creating a Nation and Australians 1838. More recently, she's published a history of the National Council of Women of Australia called Respectable Radicals, and a history of Australian adoption, The Market in Babies. She's currently completing a history of her own family that will contribute to the disciplines of both family history and South Australian history. It gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Quartly to deliver the 2022 lecture, Friendly Society or Force for Nationalism, the Australian Natives Association, 1871 to 1901.
Greetings on this beautiful ACT Day. I'm not going to be talking about the archival aspects of this subject, although one could. There's many things that I could be talking about that I'm not talking about, and you might want to ask questions about some of them at the end. On the evening of the 24th of April, 1871, some 24 young men gathered in the back room of Grimwood's Hotel, Melbourne. They came in response to an advertisement published that same day in the two major city newspapers, The Age and The Argus. Melbourne Natives, and there were two, for some reason they managed to get double for their money. Melbourne Natives attend the meeting tonight, Grimwood's Hotel, Elizabeth Street, 8 o'clock, formation of a society. In the language of the day, native referred to birthplace and patrimony. Here, the sons of white immigrants. White British immigrants. The term was borrowed from the American usage. Indigenes were implicitly excluded, a theme I shall be exploring a little. Also, in this instance, women were excluded, which I won't have room to talk about. The Argus took the meeting at Grimwood seriously enough to carry a report of its doings. The reporter found the audience confused about why they were there. There seemed to be considerable doubt in the minds of those present what the object of the society was to be. Some from the loose wording of the advertisements thinking it was a society for promoting political principles, others taking it to be a new benefit society. Some of the founders were keen that the new society should be both a benefit society and an activist organisation promoting the political interests of the native born. But the committee appointed to draw up a constitution for the body voted only for the benefit society function, that it is desirable that the gentlemen present should form themselves into a friendly and benefit society to be provisionally registered in accordance with the Friendly Societies Act. At this time, in the 1870s, the Friendly Societies of Victoria were enjoying a period of rapid growth. The longest established societies were direct imports from England, like the Oddfellows and the Foresters, established on the goldfields to give the diggers some financial security, as well as convivials and ceremonials. These had been joined in the 1860s by national societies, like the Order of St Andrew and the St Patrick Society, serving the same functions for memberships which were limited by birth and affiliation. Thus, for the Order of St Andrew, the original object of our society was a national object, the holding of games and assisting each other. This meaning of national precedes the modern idea of the nation, an idea the ANA would help to shape in Australia. It was the example of these exclusive national societies that inspired the founders of the Melbourne, then Victorian and soon-to-be Australian Natives Association. By 1871, almost 45% of the Victorian population were born in Victoria. The great majority were still children, but enough were coming of age to create a demand for friendly societies to cater specifically for the native born. The committee charged with drawing up a constitution were primarily interested in the association as a friendly society. The first point of the charter read, "The objects of the society shall be to raise from time to time a fund by subscriptions, donations and other payments as hereafter provided for the purpose of relieving sick members, defraying the expenses of funerals of members and their wives, relieving distressed widows and orphans of deceased members, and the necessary management of the society." But the committee also included a provision allowing for honorary membership, a member having no claim to any sick, funeral or medical benefits, and the final version of the rules had an entirely novel first aim, to promote the moral, social and intellectual improvement of its members. This clause would open the way to the ANA's growth as a public pressure group. Within a year, the ANA, renamed more for financial and national reasons, was hosting a grand concert which included 2 oratorical addresses, which both looked to the role of Australian natives in the future of the Australian nation. The ANA was seen as a force for change, quote, "a social federation which anticipated that political federation which was close at hand." They were a bit ahead of themselves, really. More controversially, one speaker predicted the separation of federated Australia from Great Britain. He hoped he would live to see the separation of the colony from the mother country, not a violent and bloody separation, such as that which ushered in the independence of America, but like a son going forth with his father's blessing to seek his fortune alone. This gendered language, it's inescapable. At the launch of the Ballarat branch 2 years later, the new members were told the ANA was distinguished from other friendly societies by its great object to promote the moral, social and intellectual improvement of our native-born colonists. Furthermore, the motto of the society should be Australia for the Australians, and the future belonged to the native-born. Although feeling grateful to those who had ruled so well in the past, there was now quite sufficient native talent to conduct the affairs of the country in which they were born, which they intended to live in and die in. The founding of the Ballarat branch was an important departure for the organisation. A founding member remembered the ANA was attractive because it offered both a platform for debate and a national welfare organisation. The Ballarat branch and the other goldfield branches founded from Ballarat were more interested in the mutual improvement side than the Melbourne branches were, and the programs of lectures and debates put on by the goldfield branches attracted a steady stream of new members. By 1880, the bulk of the membership and the central leadership were located in the goldfields. From 1879, the lecturing program began to touch on issues of nationalism and race. A popular lecture on the source of Britain's greatness located that source in the sterling Anglo-Saxon characteristics of the British people. Lectures on federation of the Australian politics were also popular, and debates on the Chinese question took on a highly racist tone, which I'll come back to. Ballarat was sensitive to slurs against the native born. In mid-1879, the branch took exception to an advertisement published by Dr. L.L. Smith, in which he refers, quote, in a very slanderous way to Australians. Dr. L.L. Smith advertised constantly in the Victorian press, promising to cure, amongst other things, those excesses which we have indulged in hot youth, more precisely masturbation. The offending advertisement was probably one in which he urged his readers to look at our Australian youth, see the emaciated form, the vacant look, the listless, hesitating manner, the nervous distrust, the senseless, almost idiotic expression. Note his demeanour and conversation and then say, is this a man to leave his footprints on the sands of time? But they didn't get much support from the rest of the association in trying to protest. As the 1880s dawned, essayists in Melbourne discovered a new phenomenon, the Australian race. Several assumptions were involved here. That the peoples of the world were divided into competing and evolving races, that Australia had been settled by a highly evolved Britain or British or Anglo-Saxon race with superior qualities of mind and body, and that social and environmental factors would speedily produce changes in this parent stock sufficient to create a new Australian race. I was telling my granddaughter about what I was going to lecture on, and when I told her this, she was so astounded that people could actually have believed that. But it's a really underpinning kind of belief that you can't understand any of the way they thought unless you grasp that they were totally committed to this set of beliefs. Many, in this early period, predicted that the race would decline. A schoolmaster writing in the Victorian Review saw three major flaws in the native born: a grievous dislike of mental effort, a decided disinclination to recognise the authorities of parents and supervisors, and an inordinate love of field sports. You know, nothing changes, does it? A young bank clerk, George Mudel, challenged the prophets of doom by inverting the whole argument. The Australian environment was so superior to the British that the race would be renewed in vigour. And he said, what has been accomplished is splendid, but what has to be done is sublime. And if the colonies would not flag behind in the race, their destinies must be controlled by men actuated by a burning desire for the elevation of their fellows, so that the race shall receive an impetus in its struggle for perfection, more powerful than anything it has yet achieved. So that notion of the competition of the races is, underpinning that understanding of the struggle for perfection. The ANA was slow to claim the role Mudel proposed for it. In 1882, the leaders specifically rejected the Mudelian position. It's not fair to judge the race by those noisy obstructionists and windy orators who boast of their being Australian natives. Rather than claiming Australia for the Australians, the ANA Journal professed a simple desire to do service to our native land. But it took a while to work out what that service would be. Branch members enthusiastically pursued mutual improvement in the form of lectures, poetry reading, debates, mock parliaments even, but there was little interest in national interests, those questions of importance to the coming race. When the editor of the ANA Journal called for action on the Federation of the Australasian Colonies, only two branches took up the challenge. In the end, it took the perception of an external threat to move the ANA to public agitation on questions of importance to the coming race. News came in 1883 that France was planning to use its holdings in the Pacific as a place of exile for recidivists. Multiple offenders banished from France when their sentences expired, the ANA Journal editorialised that there would be gathered at our doors within easy access a continually increasing concourse of wretches capable of glorying in the vilest crimes, in comparison with whom the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah would hardly suffer. There's a bit of a theme here. The Premier of Victoria, James Service, took a leading role in protesting French pollution, and when a number of ANA branches passed motions supporting his stand, he applauded the public spirit generally of the young Australians and their concern for an issue which affects the rising and future generation of Australia even more than the present. In November 1883, Service persuaded his fellow premiers to approve, quote, an Australian Monroe doctrine for the Southern Seas. In other words, they claimed all of the Southern Seas in the name of Britain, and a preliminary kind of confederation, a federal council to deal with matters of common concern, which was a fizzer from the word go. The ANA annual conference responded by formally adopting federation as the association's first aim. Then, in August 1884, the ANA board announced the first public demonstration, we would say protest meeting, of the Australian Natives Association, a meeting in Ballarat's Alfred Hall to strengthen the hands of the Service government in dealing with the national questions of federation, annexation and the recidivists. The meeting was not provoked by any sudden crisis. Rather, it was long planned with the aim of launching the ANA as a public pressure group. Ballarat and 4 neighbouring branches worked with the board to plan the meeting. It was organised in the grand style with, quote, a torchlight procession accompanied by local and district firemen and 2 bands of music. I don't know whether you actually picked up people as you marched through the streets. I suspect you did. You know, that was partly how you got your audience. It was a great success. After this triumph on their home ground, the board turned their attention to Melbourne, organising a second demonstration in the Melbourne Town Hall in late September. Here they could expect little branch support, but prominent native-born lawyers and politicians were persuaded to address the meeting, including James Pervs and Alfred Deakin. In opening the proceedings, the president of the ANA was at pains to justify the ANA's sally into public life, stressing that the association had nothing to do with politics or religion, but was purely a national organisation concerned with essentially Australian and national topics. So they've really moved now into that current understanding of national. The lawyer James Pervs gave the first speech of the evening. Speaking to the motion advocating federation, he moved rapidly from its virtues to its consequences. The time had arrived when they must either assist the mother country or set out on life's journey by themselves. Australia desired nothing more than to be one of the brightest jewels in an imperial crown, but if our wishes considered to be disregarded, England would run a mighty risk of losing us altogether. Cheers, says the report. Alfred Deakin took issue with Pervs. He had no desire to lose the connection with the grand old mother country. What they wanted now was something of the policy of Duke and Raleigh, cheers, to help them in their efforts to extend the glory of the British Empire. And here we have, that's Pervs speaking, and the guy with the beard and the dark glasses is Deakin. And it's an interesting slide because you can see there's women up there in the audience up on the balcony. So, you know, this is the first sort of sign I have of women taking an interest in all of this. And this meeting launched the ANA as a voice in public affairs. The newspapers reported in complimentary terms. The Argus called it a great meeting with a large audience, good speakers, and an audience quick to take their points and cheer them to the echo. The Melbourne Punch chose to make an obscure joke about natives. I assume it's Pervs in the front with the council's wig on and Deakin up the back there. But I don't understand why, on its own hook, I think that means supporting itself, but I can't actually find on its own hook in any of the slang dictionaries, so if anybody knows that term, I'd be interested. Anyway, great meeting of Australian natives. In February 1885, the board reported to the annual conference that during this year we've made our first appearance as a national society. Conference approved a statement to be read to new members, introducing them to their duties and responsibilities, and the final instruction read, "Let me impress upon you," this is what, when new members would be inducted, this is the speech that they would hear. "Let me impress upon you the fact that this association is also a national society. It seeks to create among Australian natives a national feeling and a sincere desire to advance the welfare of the land of their birth." The native self-identification as the hereditary nobility of mankind might be seen as producing positive outcomes in terms of patriotism and an active support for federation. But the inherent racism in this position had negative outcomes for Australians who were excluded by that white heritage, Indigenous Australians and people of Chinese extraction at this point. The story of Indigenous exclusion is many-layered, subtle, and much too complex to treat properly here. In brief, the Australian natives appropriated words and things thought to be Aboriginal. Corroboree to describe their balls. They had mires around the edge for the people to rest in. They had decorations of Australian plants and animals and Aboriginal artefacts, which, sort of put the Aborigines in that same class as the kind of environment. And they also took up silver boomerangs as belt ornaments to identify them in an attempt to give some content to what was really an essentially empty Australianness. These references were not to the Aboriginal presence in 1880s Victoria, but to an imagined exotic Aboriginal past. In their serious opinion-making activities, their lectures and debates, the self-consciously white natives ignored the issue of Aboriginal citizenship and the representations of the Aboriginal community, which were quite strong in the mid-1880s. Implicitly, at least, they were implicated in the destruction of that community. Again, a story that I haven't got time to go into, but the ANA's role in the exclusion of Chinese from the nation is intentional and more easily told. In 1887, the ANA board gave limited support to an agitation intended to restrict Chinese immigration into Victoria. Protest meetings and deputations had been organised by the Anti-Chinese League, a gathering of the trades affected by Chinese competition. In the words of The Age, Chinese immigration was, quote, "not a question that appeals very strongly to any but the working classes, and they cannot hope, therefore, for very much assistance or sympathy outside their own body." And the ANA did give that assistance and sympathy, or some. Leading members of the ANA had been lecturing to branches for years about the dangers, social, medical, economic, moral, offered by the Chinese presence in Victoria. In mid-1887, board member John Field Barrett called for immediate action to limit Chinese immigration. His focus was on the threat of these yellow-skinned vermin to the standard of living of Australian workers. The Chinaman enters into competition with our own working brothers. He, as a slave, toils longer hours, he lives on less, he has no wife or family to feed or educate, and the consequences of the competition of the position of the wage-earning community is deteriorated, and the nation suffers retrogression. Doesn't win out in the race. Dozens of branches responded by staging debates on the issues, and all gave verdicts strongly against the Chinaman. When the ANA Board of Directors met in August 1887, they had before them motions from a number of branches calling for action and, perhaps unexpectedly, an invitation from the Trades Hall Council to take part in a conference on the question of Chinese immigration. The board accepted the invitation with the caveat that its representatives were directed to advocate the appointment of a Royal Commission to elicit all information bearing on the subject. Field Barrett and two other directors met at Trades Hall with representatives from the market gardeners, cabinet makers and miners' unions. Field Barrett opened the proceedings. He explained that the ANA had joined the conference because the Chinese question was one of national importance, then spent the rest of his speech advocating without much conviction the Royal Commission requested by the board. It soon became clear that this solution wouldn't satisfy the conference. The market gardeners and the cabinet makers wanted prompt action to increase the poll tax, a tax on entry, and motion was moved demanding immediate legislation to this effect. When it became clear that the meeting wouldn't accept an ANA amendment for the appointment of a Royal Commission, the ANA delegation politely withdrew both the amendment and themselves from the conference. Quote, members expressed their regret at being compelled to retire, though personally they acknowledged the wisdom of Mr Trenworth's motion. The board's action roused strong feelings within the association. An ex-president found the board's participation in the Trades Hall conference so opposed to the creed of apoliticism he had defended all his days that he resigned from the association. But a dozen branches passed motions applauding the board's actions. Several others asked the board to take further action towards an increased poll tax, and the Richmond president was reported to be contemplating resignation because the board didn't go far enough. Richmond put a strongly worded motion to the 1888 annual conference that this branch is of opinion that every effort should be made by the Australian Natives Association to restrict any influx of Chinese into Australia, and that it suggests to the government that stringent regulations be adopted by them for that purpose. On its introduction to conference, this motion was challenged by a delegate on the grounds that it was a political question. The president ruled from the chair it was a national question and therefore conference could deal with it. In the animated debate that followed, popular feeling was clearly in favour of the motion and it passed by a large majority. Thus, the principle of restrictive immigration on racial grounds became part of the policy platform of the ANA and alongside Federation of the Australian Colonies. And then, of course, in the preparations for the Constitution in the 90s, it fed in that same acceptance that it's a national issue, allowed it to be part of that discussion and to feed across. Nativism within the ANA peaked in the last 2 years of the 1880s. The belief that the Anglo-Saxon would evolve to new heights in Australia and that the superior virtues of the native race were limited to the native born became the manifesto of a new style of leadership. And that leadership was populist in the sense currently seen in democracies across the world now. Charismatic, authoritarian, claiming to speak for the people and widely accepted as so doing. James Little Pervs' 2-year tenure of the ANA presidency was known to friend and foe alike as the reign of the emperor. The second half of the 1880s saw rapid growth of the ANA in Melbourne and its suburbs in terms of both membership and branches, but the Goldfield branches continued to dominate the ANA board and the presidency. The election of James Pervs was the result of a push by Melbourne branch to unite the Metropolitan branches behind a Metropolitan candidate. Pervs had been a member of the branch since 1874, but never an active one. His selection as presidential candidate was based not on his record within the association, but on his public stature as a criminal lawyer, Queen's Counsel, and ex-member of Parliament. He said later he'd been approached to stand, quote, as a man who was a public speaker of some notoriety, who had the capacity for saying interesting things to large numbers of people. The board was scandalised by Pervs' nomination. They feared the move would revive that calumny which stigmatises the ANA as a secret political organisation. They were not above personal denigration. His utterances as a public man have been such a character that his best friend could not claim for him that his strong point was sound judgment, which was probably true. Pervs won the presidency on the promise of an expanding and publicly important association. Once elected, he began at once to promote his own personal view of the association's political future. His vision, like Noodle's of 1882, was of a single Australian party representing the native born, which would govern the country in the native and hence the national interest. The content of this vision remained very unclear, but the vision was compelling. An observer reported that he told them something about the ANA they had never heard before, the idea we will draw unto ourselves in the near future the whole of the native-born Australians, imbue them with our earnestness and our ideas. When all Australians are with us, they must think as we do. When united we stand, we will act with the confidence of a victorious army, and no opposition can withstand our onslaught. Some branches responded by arguing that the ANA should change to meet this vision. Quote, the embryonic stage is now past. The ANA has grown too large for its present house, which must therefore be enlarged. This was to be achieved by dispensing with benefits, opening the membership to near natives, and supporting both political causes and the candidates who advocated them. There was no support for this from the board. Directors valued the benefit functions too highly. Pervs kept the association in the public eye with inflammatory speeches about advocating an Australian republic, causing outrage in the Victorian press, parliament and churches. The Presbyterian Assembly asked members to set aside a special week of prayers for the leaders of the ANA. Country branches of the ANA were also appalled, but Pervs had sufficient support within the association to be re-elected for a second term as president. Early in 1889, a Conservative member of the Melbourne branch challenged the whole concept of ANA public engagement by attempting to have all non-benefit activity declared illegal. He wrote to the Registrar of Friendly Societies complaining that the Melbourne branch continually discussed and voted upon, quote, questions of a political and general character which have no connection with and which may or may not be detrimental to its object as a friendly society. As illustrations, I may cite such questions as federation, colonial and imperial, separation, and so on. He also brought to the attention of the registrar a statement of the society's aims, which prefaced the official book of rules and regulations on the flyleaf. As a national association, our power is now distinctly recognised. We do not and never will interfere in questions of party politics, but in matters affecting Australia as a whole, we have claimed to be and have been heard in the past, and we will certainly demand a similar right if ever occasion demands in the future. The registrar took the complaint seriously. He replied that a society which acts in the way described runs a risk of forfeiting the protection of section 41(1) of the Friendly Societies Act of 1877 and its members of incurring the penalties of the Act mentioned in that section. The Age took the matter very seriously, advising the association to give up its dual functions on the reasonable ground that members dissenting from a political opinion couldn't resign without losing their accumulated benefits. And that really is at the heart of the opposition. When presented with Taylor's fait accompli, Melbourne branch was too flabbergasted to do more than refuse to accept the correspondence. But Pervs took up the challenge. Reviewing the executive's work for the year, he claimed the association was becoming a power in the country. He did not say the association would never interfere in party matters, but at the present time they were leading public opinion without taking an active part in political affairs, and it was quite necessary that they should do so. He dismissed the charge of illegality in a few sentences. The relevant laws had been annulled by the British Parliament. There was no ground whatsoever for the charge which had been raised. The legal point was less simple than he suggested, but Pervs was always persuasive. When the matter was raised at conference a few days later, delegates accepted his judgment and voted overwhelmingly in favour of giving the national aim the force of a rule. Thus, a Conservative intervention had the contrary effect of bringing the association to formally resolve to make itself heard in matters affecting Australia as a whole. Over the next decade, the matter that the ANA primarily took up was the cause of Australian Federation. Leading members of the association were pivotal actors in the conventions which shaped the Australian Constitution, and the campaign to persuade the Australian people to accept the new settlement was mainly carried, almost entirely carried, in Victoria by branches of the ANA. ANA involvement helped make the settlement a democratic one, the most democratic in the world at the time. And here we have, this is from the Natives Journal, and in the background there we have, I don't know if you can see it, we have the Federal Convention, and we have Fat Man, hey you there, just give me a leg over into that field. Liberal elector, not by long chalks, considering that little budget in your bag. And that's really nice too. I mean, the bushy kind of, image of the native is also very much something that the ANA culturally supported, and they loved the poetry that came from the bush. They had recitations of Gordon and later on Lawson. They were very much committed to that kind of sense of really and truly they were bushies even though they were city people. But the vision of a united masculine nation inherent in the one man, one vote doctrine, that's what's in his bag. I mean, he's got one man, one vote in his pocket, and he's got plural voting election of Senate by lower house in his little bag. That vision, inherent in the one man, one vote doctrine, did not include the Indigenous population. Now, this is not strictly about the federal constitution. It's actually the Australian natives' fate, which they had on Australia Day. They were big on Australia Day. And I don't know that there was an actual event, which I don't know that Aborigines were turned away from it. I can't find any further information. I think it's actually a reading by, I'm not sure who. I've got a couple of possible cartoonists, but I think it's his reading of the ANA's attitude, the ANA as white natives' attitude to black natives. Jackie, mine, I'm sorry about this language, mine want to go in, him fella. Mary want to go in. Attendant, no doubt, but you must pay. Jackie, no fear. Plurry foreigner pay. Mine Australian native. So, yes, that confrontation does, in a way, capture the unthinking, and obviously the cartoonist was moved by it, but nobody within the ANA, I think, had any sense that they had appropriated the name of the natives, that they had appropriated their land, that there was no, there's absolutely no sense of guilt or whatever. And nativist racism was written into the International Constitution. One of the first acts of the new National Parliament was to deny the vote to the Aboriginal natives of Australia. Women fared rather better, but that's another story. I was going to end there, but I would like just to bring you one more thought. I've been reading ABR, Australian Book Review, today, and Penny Russell, in her review of Alan Atkinson's book, says that one of the hardest tasks of historians and of us, or everybody, is, quote, to understand the conviction of right amongst those we have convicted of wrong. It's very easy to convict the ANA of racism. It's much harder to understand why they were convinced they were right and to reach for those elements of that conviction which we might want to preserve in the present day. And I think that is the task that historians have now, in a way. It is to understand the past on its own terms, not to forgive it, but to understand the past on its own terms in such a way that we can reach for those things that they were convinced were right without preserving in the present those things that we think are wrong. Thank you.
I think if I take this, and I would like to call for questions, and we have one right away.
Thanks so much, Marion. That was really fascinating. I was thinking, as particularly in relation to your earlier point about the way the ANA drew on Indigenous flora and fauna and Aboriginal imagery, and this comment here. And do you think it really was that they were unconscious of the irony of what they were doing, or was it actually necessary for them to separate out this kind of exotic symbolism from the actuality of existing natives? And clearly they had to find something that was distinctively Australian to to have that kind of association, but they didn't want to be associated with the actual natives.
Yes. The point at which, I better go back near the mic, the point at which the ANA, well, it's really difficult. Melbourne didn't have very many ragged Aborigines wandering around in it at that point. It wasn't, in fact, I really don't think they had any. Country towns did, certainly. And in the country towns, yes, I can understand that the local white natives would be they would certainly not want to be associated at all with those Aborigines who lived on the edges of the town. And the point at which they might have made an engagement was with the Corandurk people, because the Corandurk people were politically active. They were coming down and expressing their opinions to the Chief Secretary, first Berry and then Deakin, particularly about the doings of the Aboriginal board, what are they called? That was running Corandurk. And Deakin actually was sympathetic when he was Chief Secretary, to the extent that he amended the powers of the Aboriginal board and made them less restrictive and punitive. But he continued with an act which effectively meant that the only people that could live at Corandurk were full-bloods. So the racism, the notion of, he was quite convinced that the rest of them would move into the population and be absorbed and be able to share in a white Australian future. And that was very much the understanding, I think, of those people within the ANA who thought about it. So there's a sense in which it isn't driven, it's not driven by fear and loathing, unlike the Chinese one, which is driven by fear and loathing. It's driven by a complete misunderstanding of the nature of culture and race. Does that make sense? Yes. The big guns.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Marion. That was fascinating. Your wonder about whether, or query about whether that was a real incident had me scurrying to the phone because I thought I'd remembered something, and I did, but it's not 1897. This is from 1905. I'm going to be able to read it. I'll take my glasses off. That's easier. While Senator Keating was discoursing on Wednesday at the Australian Natives Association conference at Bensdale, so it's in Gippsland, on the advantages of technical education to Australian natives, an odd figure garbed in military uniform appeared at the doorway of the hall. Though not a member of the association, the visitor was undoubtedly an Australian native. A huge medal hanging from a string encircling his swarthy neck set forth that he was of royal birth, being no other than King Bobby of Bundawal. With many broad and amiable grins and much scraping and bowing, he advanced into the hall. A great roar of laughter and some cheering greeted his appearance, and the President ordered his removal. As, however, he respectfully uncovered his head and evinced much interest in the proceedings, he was accommodated with a seat and allowed to listen to the speeches of his white compatriots.
That's fabulous.
1905, yeah.
That is terrific. Actually, I have read a bit about the Bensdale Conference, but I missed that bit. Thank you. What's it in?
It's quoted in Steel Rudd's magazine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I should check it out. I'm thinking I should write an article, actually, about this. It's one of those things that I would like to do before I actually stop writing. So thank you very much. That's really useful. So the city-country is a distinction. Yes.
Thanks for your excellent address, Marion. Given the early reference you made to a meeting between the early ANA and the trade union movement, which I conclude is in Victoria, and the general scepticism that the trade union movement had towards federation at the time. Was there any continuing relationship between the ANA and the trade union movement, and was the ANA successful in persuading in any shape or form the trade union movement
Yes.
against its scepticism?
Yes, yes. The ANA set up a Metropolitan Federation Conference, which moved very slowly, far more slowly than the parallel body in Sydney, towards any kind of commitment to what they were asking for. It's a bit like the Republic issue, you know. There's a sort of commitment to federation or the Republic, but the content is very slow. They took like 2 years to have a long. They had meetings of unionists, they had meetings of employers, and they got them both to agree to come onto a committee which would pursue federal issues. They managed to sort out the protection free trade issue to the extent of that they had to have both, you know, protection against the world and free trade inside. And it was that was in about 94, 95. It was really only towards the end that, and of course Trenworth was very busy in that, and Trenworth was really quite close to Peacock and those guys. So, you know, there's a sort of a liberal kind of penumbra there that did take in, I think, could take in some of the trade union attitudes and opinions. And it was really only when Higgins came out very firmly against the bill, and he'd been a member of the ANA and working with the ANA, and it was only right at the end when he came out and took some of the more bolshy trade unions with him that you actually got a strong opposition emerging and a strong voice. And it was never as strong in Victoria as it was in New South Wales. And I think that was it was the Metropolitan Committee's kind of bringing everybody together that can be thanked for that.
Like Frank, I went to my phone because I wanted to see if there was anything out there about the hook thing. And it's come up with something in the Collins Dictionary, on one's own hook. Slang, mainly US, on one's own initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. I did have a little look, but obviously I wasn't looking hard enough. Thank you. Well, we can add that to our knowledge of Australian slang. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion, for the lecture, and thank you for this collective learning that's going on here. Marion, you've spoken about the regional and the national with the ANA. I'm really struck when I go through the pages of the British Australasian of the ANA's presence abroad, how it becomes a kind of epicentre for expatriate Australians. I'm wondering whether you'd like to comment on that. I know it's a little bit later largely, but...
I don't know very much about it. I have read a bit about the... no, look, I'm no expert on that, but certainly it was a uniting force amongst the London people, and it actually took in women as well, because by that stage you do get the Australasian Women's Association, which is the sister branch of the ANA, runs parallel to it, and it's those women, I think, who were actually at least as important as the blokes in the overseas London native configuration. They did cooeys up and down the Strand, you know. Women as well. So yes. And there's one up the back too.
Thanks, Marion. This question sort of goes back to the earlier one about Aboriginal people. So, Meston's Wild Australia show performed at the 1893 gala event.
Sorry, I missed.
Okay, so Archibald Meston's Wild Australia show of performing Aboriginal people performed at the 1893 gala, which
Yes.
is a picture here, I think, also of these fates,
Yes.
which were really important for trying to make the 26th of January.
Yes.
And actually, what's interesting about that was they had a contract to perform, and then the ANA thought that they hadn't performed well enough to be paid what the contract was, which was sort of marked the end of the Wild Australia show, I think. But what was interesting to me about it was how commercial they were for the fates, that there was certainly money to be made by the ANA, and I just wondered whether you had something to say about their sort of commercial...
It was a commercial exercise. I mean, you know, you must pay. That I'm sure that's quite deliberate because they were criticised for that. The money partly went to the medical benefit funds, but a lot of it went to the individual branches that were involved, and they did things like buying pianos, for example. And yes, it was a money-making exercise. It was worse than that. It was a gambling exercise because when you bought a ticket, that had a number on it, and then there was a draw, and there was a large prize, and they came under constant attack from the mid-90s by mainly women's groups complaining that they were supporting gambling. And in the end, they ceased to do the draw, and the profits of the whole thing fell off considerably. So yes, I'm not at all surprised that they took a commercial line to it. I have a picture of that advertising that performance. I didn't know the backstory. If you could contact me, marian.quartly@monash.edu, no AU, Monash is universal. If you could possibly do that, I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. I'm a former batter for the Fairfield A&A Cricket Club in Melbourne. In fact, our club rooms were called a dispensary, which I presume was a remnant of its medical benefits function, would be my guess.
Yes.
But the question I wanted to ask was about
Still medical benefits. I mean, it goes back to being medical benefits.
This is the 1970s or early 80s, I guess. But I wanted to ask about republicanism. Victoria doesn't really seem to spawn the same Republican press and Republican organisations and clubs that Sydney did. Yeah. And I wonder if a reason for that is that the ANA was a kind of vehicle for at least some Republicans, from what you're saying. I mean, obviously Republicanism stalked the organisation.
It was a very brief Republican sort of flare-up in the ANA. There were plenty of Republicans. There were the Irish Republicans who were big and important. The ANA, it was during Pervs' time. He went to Sydney to try and establish a branch up there, and because he always followed the crowd when he was lecturing, he was carried into a declaration for separation. And when he came back to Melbourne, this vastly encouraged some Republicans in the Melbourne ranks. And they did things like refusing to rise to toast to the Queen. But it all, and as I say, brought an enormous amount of criticism down on their heads and mostly backed off. So it really was like a 3 or 4 month kind of only. I think also they were really worried about being associated with the much more radical Irish republicanism, which was very strong in Melbourne, at least for a little while. So, but I think you're right that the major Deacon's version, which was, we are members of a great empire and will be its greatest, the jewel in the crown, that sort of patriotism, imperialism, became absolutely standard across the organisation.
Mine is another sort of serendipitous thread. I was listening while driving somewhere to the ABC radio program, which was about the establishment of the acclimatisation society across Australia. And it leads back to your comment about Aboriginal living in Melbourne, and it's around that time frame, because I think I kind of did a sort of wick with the car, because there was one little bit that came in, it just sort of popped into the conversation, then moved out again, about the establishment of the Melbourne Zoological Gardens. And they said that one of the displays there was an Aboriginal family who were there on display every day from a certain time period, and then they were removed back to the borders of the city where they lived. And so apparently they had a family that people could come and stare at and look at, and humpies and all those sorts of things there that they
presumably
lived in.
dressed in not in European clothing, and
they didn't give a particular description of how it was, and so it was just something when that was there, and I thought, wow, I heard that on the radio, that in that time period, that was how it was being shown.
So the natives weren't alone. In fact, they were probably not as bad as some of their elders in taking that kind of understanding of flora and fauna and Aboriginal natives. Oh, how important.
But being celebrated in the fact that European trees, grasses, plants, insects and animals were being populated and fished throughout the entire environment.
Period, didn't they? I mean, they came from the greatest race the world had ever seen. Oh.
Are there any more questions? That's been fantastic, all of those questions and pieces of information. I'm going to hand the microphone now to Bruce, or invite Bruce up.
Well, it now falls to me as the chair of the Friends of the Noel Butlin Archives, and I am reliably told a bit of an odd fellow myself, to offer some closing reflections and a vote of thanks on behalf of us all. May I too begin by acknowledging that where we are today always was, and it always is going to be, Aboriginal country, how privileged we are that our campus bears the name of Canberra. In reflecting on your lecture tonight, Marion, I'd rather call it your oratorical address, and I think it should have been by torchlight. I want to take you right back to the beginning. By that, I don't actually mean your opening remarks, although that framework really got us all very excited, that meeting in a pub in Ringwood in 1871. I want to reach further back. I want to place your lecture tonight in a longer historical trajectory. I want to take you back to when the foundations of your lecture were laid, in that PhD thesis submitted at Monash University rather late in the last century. Now, that's a very unkind way to put that. It's technically correct, I fear. It was a hefty blue volume, I recall, with your name and the thesis title edged deep in the spine. I remember, and this was the last century, so I admit there might be a bit of mismemory here, that every page bore the uneven imprint of a typewriter, and that the F letter was slightly out of shape, bent away by all that earnest thumping on the page. And some of those pages, Marion, I remember, were splashed with whiteout, and the thesis itself was in that long-forgotten medium, the carbon copy. Remember that? This was an age when we thought word processing might be a kitchen implement. And I imagined if I showed your thesis to a group of students today, they would treat it with the kind of reverence we would any historical artefact. Why am I saying all this? Because it alerts us to two central points about your lecture this evening. What you always said to me when I was your student is that history is a matter of change. Sudden change that overnight reshapes a cultural or political landscape, or slow change that erodes away at the old world we know. But always, you said to me, history is about change. By the same token, I am struck at how that first pioneering inquiry into the Australian Natives Association, your thesis, has broadened, has extended, has changed. Again, I might be misremembering, but many of the most exciting themes you raised for us this evening, the importance of gender,
The gendered language was inescapable, as you put it. The nexus between the regional and the wider national community. The disturbing, but as you remind us, very complex appropriation of Aboriginality. The emphasis you gave us tonight on performance, that wasn't so much in evidence in your thesis. Now that's important for all of us as scholars, as historians, because it shows us how a historian can review her work late into her career and how she can go back and rethink the original thesis, the original ideas. And most important for us at the Noel Butlin Archives, how re-immersion in the historical record, in our historical record, Catherine, can continue to challenge and inspire us all. Marion, tonight you have breathed new life into the old. And that brings me to a second point. History, you told me and Ray, and I expect all your students, is about continuity as much as it is change. And I saw that continuity tonight between your PhD and the learned lecture you've just delivered. All the hallmarks of a fine historian, the analytical acumen, the diligent, painstaking research, the sudden, arresting insight, your comments there about the unthinking appropriation of the Aboriginal ring loud to me. And all of that imagery that you brought to us was very much there this evening. Most important of all, perhaps, your lecture reminded us how history isn't just about the past, it's about the present in the past. And what I'll take away from this evening is your lines about populism, the populism that today haunts the globe, and also the way that you invited us tonight to rethink the national. And if we're going to rebuild this country, as we surely must, along the lines of the treaty and the Uluru Statement, we must rethink the national. So we thank you, Marion, for all these things. We acknowledge your fellowship and your wisdom. I said a moment ago that I was once your student. I'm reminded tonight that I still am. Thank you. We thank Marion, but there are a few other thanks I do need to make. To Catherine Dan, our university archivist, and truly the architect of this evening, aided, of course, by Michelle, Sarah, Megan, and all the rest of the library team. We thank the Friends Secretary, Ewan Maidment. Without Ewan, nothing would ever get done, and without Ewan, there would be no drinks for tonight. No greater tribute there, Ewan. We also thank the other members of the Friends Executive Committee, and I especially want to thank Colleen McEwen, Carol McNally, and Anne Piggott for the delicious nibbles that they've prepared for us this evening. Finally, I thank you, the audience, both here and out there online. I too, though, would like to acknowledge the presence here tonight of the Dean of the College of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Ray Francis, who, as Catherine has said, was as always a steadfast patron of the archives over the years. It's great to see the first archives lecturer and the 21st archives lecturer sitting side by side. What a lovely conjunction. Now, in closing, Marion, the archives, the Noel Butlin Archives, does harbour just a few traditions. One is that we present our distinguished annual lecturer with a book that we hope will continue to inspire you on your onward journey into history. And I actually can't think of a better book than the one we offer you today. When Stuart McIntyre died this year, the Friends lost a great patron and we lost a great historian. But a book like this, Stuart's book, The Party, reminds us that his testimony is still very much with us, and it renews that historian's faith in the power and the imperative of change. Please accept it on behalf of us all. That concludes this evening. There's delicious nibbles and a couple of drinks waiting outside. Please do join us.